Have you ever heard the expression, God favors children and fools? In today's episode, we're going to explore the life of a very eccentric man who made very good in life while exercising very little real good judgment, and who had the greatest luck in the world. He was both a fool and beloved by many because of it. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Me, Myself, and I History, where weird history and strange happenings in the universe are always on the menu. My name is Seraphim. In most of my episodes thus far, we have covered multiple stories with a related theme. Today, we'll explore just one single individual's life. His life was so strange, and his fortune so outrageously odd, that some folks wonder at him even today. The further we get into his story, the stranger it becomes. Without further ado, let's get started. Timothy Dexter's ancestors first came to North America in the mid-1600s. They were poor and Irish as far as we know about them. That also means they were likely either desperately indigent or possibly indentured servants. No matter how one looks at it, they were a poor family, and they stayed that way by all appearances. Timothy was born on 22 January 1747 in Malden, province of Massachusetts Bay, British North America. Like many children in that time, he received little schooling at all. He dropped out at the age of 8 in order to take up farm labor with his family. At age 16, he became a tanner's apprentice. Tanning was one of those jobs that was in high demand but was not well regarded. It left the area around the tanneries smelling like death and decay and manure and sometimes even urine. Ever hear the expression piss poor? That comes from indigent families that sold their urine for tanning hides. It was definitely not a job that got one invited into polite society, though all of society required what tanners provided. So much so that it was one of the most regulated businesses in colonial New England. At times, the law required that tanners prove their methods in court and prove they weren't wasting any usable parts of the hide in order to enter business at all. Timothy Dexter had greater plans than to be a simple tanner for the rest of his life. He was going to be a society man somehow. However, when Malden's and Greater Boston's polite society did not accept his ambitions, he determined to make a new start. In 1769, at the age of 22, he moved to Newburyport. Here he soon married a wealthy widow named Elizabeth Frothingham. Frothingham had 4 children, a modest bit of wealth, and was 9 years older than Dexter. How did this motley fool ever convince her to marry him? The world may never know, but it happened. Timothy took his new wife's wealth, which was now legally his, and he bought a mansion in town and opened up a shop in the basement where he sold moosehide gloves, belts, and trousers, as well as other hides and whale blubber. Elizabeth opened her own shop, which sold notions for the ladies to use in their sewing. It is unclear how successful it was, but it appears to have been sufficiently profitable to meet their needs and give them some savings. Timothy, ever aspiring to greater things, knew a deal when he saw it. Now, don't misunderstand me here. His business sense was anything but conventional. It was the sort of dumb luck we all want to stand in the shadow of just so some of it will rub off on us. At the end of the American Revolution in 1789, the continental dollars that had been circulating had almost no value whatever. The expression, not worth a continental, was equivalent of today's not worth a plugged nickel. That is, something whose value is less than nothing. The fact that the British had counterfeited large numbers depreciated them even further. Banknotes and letters of credit issued by states were not quite this badly off, but they were still nonetheless heavily depreciated. Timothy bought them up like crazy. All the continentals and all the Massachusetts notes he could obtain. In 1790, when Congress agreed to pay for continentals at 1% face value and Massachusetts paid for their notes at face value, Timothy made bank, as we would say today. However odd Timothy Dexter's business sense might have been, he was no spendthrift. He invested his gains into building 2 ships and started an export business to the West Indies and to Europe. This was the beginning of his meteoric rise as one of the nouveaux riches of the early republic in Massachusetts. In any age, those with old money and high-born manners will inevitably look down on the nouveau riche with their newly made fortunes and their lower-class manners and tastes. The more successful, the more they are snubbed in polite society. Timothy was no different. Other wealthy men conspired to bankrupt him. They probably figured to get a good laugh out of this foolish man in the process, but it failed. But more on that in a moment. Timothy felt that now that he was one of the wealthy in the area, he should take an active interest in and participate in public affairs. He began a letter-writing campaign promoting himself for public office. After some time, the Newburyport City Council appointed him to the newly created office of Informer of Deer. His sole job was to inform the council if deer were spotted near Newburyport. There were no deer in that area for decades, as they had been hunted off as settlers from Europe arrived in the previous century, both to provide food and hides, but also to protect croplands in areas newly adapted for farming. No doubt the city council got a chuckle out of it. Timothy seems to have accepted it with pride, though there were no deer spotted in his tenure. Perhaps he reckoned that as one of his great successes. Now, back to the collusion of his betters. Timothy was advised to sell bed warmers, a sort of a small pan with a vented lid on a hinge and a large wooden handle used to preheat beds in New England winters, to the West Indies. Of course, the West Indies, better known today as the Caribbean, is a semi-tropical to tropical climate. His ship captain took them there and then sold them as ladles for molasses production. The ploy made a healthy profit. Another time, Newburyport had a real problem with feral and stray house cats. Knowing he had an excess of something he could gather, he collected all the stray cats he could and shipped them to the Caribbean. As it turns out, they were having a rat infestation in several Caribbean islands, and the cats were welcomed, once again at a nice profit. Shipping coal to Newcastle has been an expression for doing something perfectly useless for centuries. Newcastle has been a coal mining region in Northumbria since at least the time of Henry III in the 13th century. At the turn of the 19th century, it was one of the single most productive coal fields in the world. Shipping coal there would have been foolhardy and the venture would have lost money, unless you're Timothy Dexter. Again, polite company took a proverb and suggested it to Timothy as a business idea. Timothy shipped a boatload of coal to Newcastle, and it arrived in the midst of a miners' strike and, well, you guessed it, it sold at a premium. Timothy's luck doesn't end there. Timothy was convinced to sell woolen mittens to the West Indies. When his ship arrived, his ship captain made contact with Asian traders who then bought them and shipped them to Siberia very profitably. The ploy was tried a second time. This time it was suggested that he sell them in the South Pacific Islands. His ship took them there. They met Portuguese traders who bought them and took them to China where they sold very well. Another time he stocked up on whale bones. It looked like disaster might have actually caught up with the man.
I don't think so. No.
Nope, not this time either. He profitably sold them off as corset stays. Whatever outrageous and unlikely successes he may have had, it's clear Timothy Dexter knew how to locate something others didn't value, corner the market, and then turn a profit. In fact, across multiple sources, I was unable to find any examples of a failure to match his successes. A motley fool indeed. So what does a motley fool like Timothy Dexter spend all of his money on? He bought a mansion. He promptly decorated it with 40 pedestals surrounding a garden, each with a famous personage or goddess in statue of carved wood. His mansion was given minarets, a gilded eagle on top of the cupola, and an elaborate mausoleum for himself. Oh, and he had one of those 40 pedestals that was for a statue of himself. It had the inscription, "I am the first in the East and the first in the West, and I am the greatest philosopher in the world." I'm sure the locals couldn't disagree more. In his free time, he wrote a book entitled A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. It was a long stream of consciousness sort of book. It used unusual spellings unique to Timothy himself and random capitalization. It also used no punctuation whatsoever. The book was self-published and given away. It became popular as a curiosity item, and a publisher was found to print a second edition. Readers, however, had begged for punctuation in this edition. Timothy Dexter, ever the strange one, added a single page of punctuation marks in the back of the book with a note for the reader to place them wherever they liked them most. It went through 6 more editions. He also bought a second home in Chester, Massachusetts. He began to insist the locals call him Lord Timothy Dexter, Earl of Chester. In order to entice them to do so, he would offer children a quarter if they would call him that, and offered dinner and drinks for adults who would do so. The locals soon caved in to his eccentric preferences, and it became something of a local joke. In spite of his success and the humorous relationships he had with the public, his family life suffered. His wife had become somewhat estranged from him. He told people that she died and that the woman they saw about the premises was simply her ghost haunting him. She was, of course, quite alive and still living in the home, no doubt giving him a lot of side-eye. He kept an elaborate coffin in his home. He would show it to people and tell them that he was going to be buried in it. And then one day he faked his death.
Why, oh why, oh why, oh why?
He couldn't find a priest or a preacher to take part in the ruse, so he hired a hack to play the part. A requiem was sung, a eulogy was given, and he was transported into his mausoleum, all as if dead. Then the funeral party was in full swing. Copious amounts of alcohol and food flowed. Everyone seemed to be having the time of their lives at Timothy's expense, both the financial sort and the proverbial variety. Timothy, unbeknownst to the funeral goers, had snuck back into the house. Finding his wife dry-eyed, he was outraged. He had her caned for it. His stepson was teary-eyed to his satisfaction, but he had quite a bit of alcohol in his system by that point, and the tears flowed quite freely. Alas, Timothy Dexter died for real after a heart attack on 23 October 1806. He had hired an amateur poet and local fisherman to burnish his reputation further, but it didn't work. Most of his contemporaries in society found him to be quite unintelligent, or as the local obituary recorded it, quote, his endowments not being of the most exalted stamp, close quote, he was a laughingstock. His whole life was one long case of him thinking far too highly of himself and the public thinking of him far below his seemingly endless luck. He wasn't buried in his mausoleum, but rather in a local cemetery instead, with only a simple headstone which stands today. And there you have it, the life of one of America's most foolishly successful entrepreneurs. A man who married into money, who made good on it, and then evaded every attempt by others to bankrupt and discredit him. His improbably lucky deals made him a modest fortune bigger than the one he had married into. It also made a name for him as one of the most eccentric people of his time, arguably America's only nobleman, the Earl of Chester. If you liked this episode, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to hit that notification icon to be updated on more great weird history stories from this channel. Tell your friends and family who like weird history. Comment if you have something to add to today's story or just want to add your own thoughts. Until next time, my friends, this is Seraphim with Me, Myself, and I History signing off.